For over 40 years, the world basically lived on a knife's edge. You had two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in this massive standoff. And they had enough nuclear weapons to literally destroy civilization many, many times over. They were fighting for everything: influence, ideology, you name it. But here's the central question, the real mystery of it all. If they were such bitter enemies for so long, why didn't they ever actually go to war? I mean, no direct battles, no official declaration. How is that even possible? Okay, let's dive in and really unpack one of the most dangerous periods in all of human history. So to really get the Cold War, you have to rewind the clock back to the moment it all started, right at the end of World War II, 1945. Europe was just in ruins. Old empires were collapsing, and out of all that chaos, two nations rose to become more powerful than anyone else. And what's so wild is just how fundamentally different these two new superpowers were. I mean, polar opposites. You've got the United States championing democracy, capitalism, individual freedom, and then you have the Soviet Union built on completely opposing ideals: communism, total state control, a one-party system. Yeah, they were allies against Hitler and World War II, but as soon as that common enemy was gone, well, their deep-seated differences created tension almost immediately. And this is where the line in the sand was officially drawn. In 1947, the U.S. rolled out the Truman Doctrine, basically a promise to help any nation fighting off communism, plus the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe. The Soviets, of course, saw this as a huge threat. And just like that, the world was split right down the middle: the capitalist West versus the communist East. The Cold War was on. But this wasn't going to be a war fought with tanks and soldiers in the same old way. Oh no. A single technological breakthrough was about to change the rules of conflict forever. It created this terrifying new logic that would define the next 4 decades. In 1949, the game completely changed. America's monopoly on the atomic bomb was over. The Soviets had their own. This single event shifted the entire global balance of power and introduced a kind of fear humanity had just never experienced before. Now, both sides had the power to completely annihilate the other. This led to a doctrine with a fittingly dark acronym: MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. And the logic? Well, it was as simple as it was terrifying. Nobody could win a nuclear war. If you launched your missiles, you knew for a fact that the other side's missiles were already on their way to you. It was basically a global suicide pact. And here's the central paradox of the whole era. It sounds completely insane, doesn't it? But it worked. The very thing that made war so unbelievably terrifying is the very thing that stopped it from happening: this shared fear of total annihilation. It became a deterrent more powerful than any army could ever be. So, if they couldn't fight each other head-on, how did they compete? Well, the battlefield just moved. It went underground, into the shadows, and into other countries. And that created decades of conflict all across the globe. This is where we get the idea of proxy wars. Let's take the Korean War as a perfect example. You had the Soviet-backed North fighting the US-backed South. Now, American and Soviet soldiers never fired a shot at each other directly, but their weapons, their money, and their influence were all over that conflict. And you saw this same pattern play out for decades in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and dozens of other places. But look, all these proxy wars and spy games, it was a really dangerous balancing act. And there was one moment, one terrifying moment, when the whole thing almost came crashing down. For 13 days in October of 1962, the entire world just held its breath as the two superpowers stared each other down, right on the brink of the abyss. It all started when American spy planes discovered that the Soviets were putting nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The U.S. threw a naval blockade around the island, bombers were put on high alert, and for 13 straight days, one wrong move, one tiny miscalculation, could have literally ended the world. In the end, disaster was avoided. But why? Because when they were faced with that final, terrible choice, both President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev really understood the fundamental rule of the nuclear age. They understood MAD. They knew there would be no winners. They chose restraint because the only alternative was unthinkable. So the Cold War would drag on for another 20 years. But the seeds of its conclusion, they weren't being planted on a battlefield. They were growing inside the Soviet system itself, which was really starting to crack under the immense pressure of this whole conflict. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was, frankly, a mess. It was being crippled by the massive cost of the arms race. So when a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, took power in 1985, he knew something radical had to be done. He brought in two big ideas: glasnost, which meant more openness, and perestroika, a complete restructuring of the economy. The simple truth was, the Soviet Union just couldn't afford the Cold War anymore. And this internal change led to maybe the most powerful symbol of the Cold War's end. The Berlin Wall didn't come down because of an invasion or some big battle. Nope. It was pushed over by ordinary people who were demanding freedom, and the system on the other side was just too weak and too broke to stop them. Okay, so let's pull all these threads together and finally answer that question we started with. After all those decades of tension, proxy wars, and terrifying close calls, why did the Cold War never actually turn hot? So what were the keys? Well, number one, and this is the big one, nuclear weapons. They just made a direct war unwinnable thanks to MAD. That raw fear of total destruction was a more powerful peacekeeper than any treaty. Then you have the proxy wars, which, as dangerous as they were, gave both sides an outlet for their rivalry without a direct clash. And don't forget the economics of it all. The relentless pressure of the arms race basically bankrupted the Soviet system from the inside out. Finally, you have to remember the lessons of history. Leaders on both sides remembered the absolute devastation of two world wars, and they were desperate not to start a third. When you really step back and look at it, the story of the Cold War is a pretty chilling lesson. It shows us that in an age of unbelievable power, the greatest strength isn't always the willingness to fight, but maybe it's the wisdom to know when not to. It proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is restraint.